Lecture 1, Grain Lines. All right, to begin with, if you watch the video A Stitch in Time on Marie Antoinette, you'll have seen the two, the host and the tailor, Nina, talking a great deal about grain lines and the importance of grain lines, and especially on particularly fine fabrics. So I want to go back over what grain lines are so that you guys are aware of what that means. I'm going to show you here, I have a piece of red and black gingham, and you can see here the selvage. Now, this is an important piece of fabric because it is a woven pattern. So gingham, which refers to this small checked fabric, and sometimes the checks can be quite large. In this case, they're about 1/8 of an inch, and they're woven in. So that is to say, this black line and this red line are actually red threads and black threads. And if you look closely, where the two cross, if the black isn't woven dominant on top, the red takes on sort of a burgundy quality. And that's because the black threads are weaving on top of the red threads. All right, so this is important because a woven pattern like this gingham means that this black line that's running across is a straight grain, and this black line or red line running parallel to the selvage is also a grain line. So let me just go back over some terms that I've just used and that we've used in class, but I want to reiterate. This is a selvage. This is where the warp threads, and you can remember the warp threads are the long, sturdy threads. They run parallel to this selvage. Those threads are oftentimes, in modern weaving, miles and miles long. So they have to be strong and sturdy. The weft threads are the ones that run perpendicular to the selvage. So they're going to come over the selvage and then wrap back around and go back in. And that gives us a really tight line right along this edge where each warp thread or each weft thread has gone over the furthest outside warp thread. This is a self-edging part of the weave, and so it has been shortened to the term selvage. Now, the threads that run parallel to the warp threads, that is to say the strongest threads, those are the strongest, and we call them the straight of grain. They run parallel to the selvage. Because they are those super sturdy threads, they're very stable. They'll stand up against a lot of pull. So if I pull on this thread or this fabric, you can see there's very little give on the straight of grain. Now the cross grain, in this case, is made up of the same threads as the warp thread, and that's how we get that woven check. But the weft threads run from selvage to selvage, and they run perpendicular to the straight of grain. So they are perpendicular to the selvage. Those tend to be in really fine fabrics like silks, brocades, satins. Those are going to be the fluffier, prettier threads, and so therefore they're not quite as stable. And even in this example, if I pull on the cross grain, you can see I get way more stretch this way than I get this way with the same amount of pressure. So that is straight of grain, which is parallel to the selvage, cross grain, which is perpendicular to the selvage, and then the last and trickier of the two is the bias. And the bias is going to run 45 degrees to the two grains, and it is by far the stretchier. Now, we use bias a lot in theater. We'll cut strips of bias, and I'll show you how we do that in a minute. But we cut strips of bias and we use it as a finishing tool. Because of its stretchy nature, you can stitch it out around a curve, and it'll stretch out to follow that curve, where a straight grain would pucker, or even the cross grain would pucker on that curve. The bias is going to give you a little more ease there. Bias is also, there are periods in history where bias has been the predominant form of cutting. The 30s, with those slinky gowns, were oftentimes cut on the bias. But very practical things can be cut on the bias as well. A lot of early dancewear was cut on the bias so that it would stretch. Lingerie has been cut on the bias, men's swimsuits, prior to the advent of stretchy nylon and spandex fibers. A lot of the men's swimwear was cut on the bias. And it would just give it that stretch that's going to go out over the curves of the body a little bit nicer. All right, so that's straight of grain, cross grain, and bias. This is a woven pattern. This is a printed pattern. I cannot trust that this green line that I see here is going to be absolute true straight of grain because it's printed. And you can see the difference between these two. No matter which side I turn this gingham to, the fabric is the same. And that's because it's woven in that pattern. This, however, is woven as a plain cream cotton or a plain white cotton. You can see on the edge here where the printing does not go. The original color of the textile, the cotton, was white. And then they've printed all of these colors on in a series of prints. Printing on cotton and silk and painting on cotton and silk go way back in time, but it was the Victorians who perfected painting with a roller. So they made a pattern that repeated itself perfectly, and they would carve it onto a copper base and then roll print it onto the fabric so you could repeat the same pattern over and over and over and over. And as long as it was going through a paint to recharge, it would just keep printing the same quality. So printed patterns you can't trust. Even if this were a printed gingham, I couldn't trust that it was on the straight of grain. I would need to measure from the edge of the selvage. And one of the ways that we do that is just to put a ruler on it, and if one part of my grain line is here, I want my next to be there. And I'll explain that a little bit more when I start showing you some patterns later on in this lecture. Okay, so you can't trust a printed pattern to be straight of grain, but you can almost always trust a woven pattern to be straight of grain. Now, this area that I've been fiddling with you guys, I would need to take back over and steam and get it to lay down flat because I've pulled it on the bias, and that will start to make the grain line a bit wavy. So there is that. You need to be careful with that. Ninia referred to pulling a thread when she was talking about weaving a very fine, or hemming a very fine cotton. And I've pulled the finest cotton I have here, and you can see the difference between these two in that this is not at all opaque. There's no it's totally opaque. There's no transparency. But you can actually see the grain line, or the lines of my gridded mat here underneath this grain line. Now, this is a technique that honestly we don't do too much in theater. I have worked in theaters, in costume shops where they do this when they're doing very fine work. I don't have a lot of experience doing this. I tend to trust my eye to find the grain line. But if you are dealing with a very fine woven fabric, it is a method by which you can get a perfect grain line. Now, the trick is to try and just pull one thread. And I got one thread there, and hopefully I can hang on to it. You want to ease that thread along. And you can see it's puckering up there as I go. The problem is it gets difficult to not snap that thread like I just did there, so hopefully I'll be able to do this. So you pull up that thread with a pin, and you're trying to just get one thread. Now, I can't stress how gentle you have to be doing this. because that thread is very, very weak. So you want to keep your finger near the textile here. So I'm not getting this hand way out here holding on to that thread. Oh, and I just snapped it. It was inevitable that I would do that. I'll see if I can pick it up again, but even if I can't pick it up, you can see that very fine, oops, sorry, I bumped the camera there. Perhaps you can see that very fine line running along. Where did you go? Right there, I keep bumping the camera, I'm sorry. That very fine puckered line. I will attempt to pick this thread back up again. I am doing it at a disadvantage because I can't get close to the fabric to find it without bumping the camera. That's why you want to be super careful. I'm going to try and pick up another thread. There we go. Oh, I managed to draw a warp thread as well. I only want the weft thread. Because remember, those are the ones that run weft to right. There we go. Oh, you can see why I don't do this very often. This is fiddly little work, just to be certain that you have a grain line. Now, this is the sort of thing that really fine workshops, like Paris workshops that build couture clothing will do. I, however, am not a huge fan of this. So there is, let's bring it back in so you guys can see it. There is that line, and you can just see it starting to form. Now, if I work that all the way across and just kept pulling this, very fine thread out, one after the other. Oh, see, you can see I got a warp thread there because it's pulling this way. I want to get just that weft thread. You can see I could keep working my way across, and that would give me a very fine line, which would be absolutely straight of grain, and then I could pull that out and use that as a cutting line. I've also used this, now I have used this technique with woolens and pulled until I got one thread out so that I could be sure. Wool is a lot more forgiving than this fiddly tight woven cotton. It's easier to get just one thread lifted up, and the thread tends to be a little bit thicker. Oh, see what I did there again? I got a warp thread, which I don't want. Well, anyway, you can see that's what Ninio was talking about, getting that super fine line right there. You can see, maybe if I move it over. Maybe if I put something dark underneath it, that will help. Yeah, that made it a lot easier to see. So that's that line she was working to pull one thread out all the way across a 45-inch piece of cotton. So if it is absolutely important that the bottom be perfectly straight, and the point she was making with that chemise à la reine, or the queen's chemise, was that to get a really nice hem, you have to have that perfect straight line. So if you're making one of those, or you're making something that needs that perfect straight line, then that's the route to get there. All right, I want to take a second and talk about the difference between weaves, fabrics, and fibers. This gingham that we've been working with, the weave on this is a good sturdy over-under weave. That is to say that the weft thread goes over one warp, under one warp, over one warp, under one warp, over, under. And then the next one up, it just moves the sequence one to the left. So if I went over this one on the previous row, I go under it, over it, under it, over it. This staggering of warp lines is like a brick wall. When they stagger the bricks, it's stronger. So it just makes for a stronger weave. This is a sturdy little strong weave. This also is a strong weave, the fine muslin that I was pulling the thread on. It's 1 over 1 under, 1 over 1 under. But there are other textiles that are woven where the top fiber, or the weft fiber, will go over multiple wefts and then back under 1 over 5, under 1 over 5. This is a silk satin, and it employs over 1, under 2, over 1, under 2 sort of thing. But there are other silk satins that change color dramatically in the weaving. So this is another example of a type of satin weave. This is more like under 1 warp, over 5, under 1, over 5. And the shiny side, what we would typically think of the right side, is very, very light. But the back side is very, very dark, and you can see the contrast between the two. This happens because the back has more of the warp threads showing, and the weft has more of, or the right side has more of the weft or shinier fibers. So there's, under 1, over 5, under 1, over 5, as we weave along here, perpendicular to the selvage. So it makes for a more lustrous textile. The surface is shiny, the back is usually dull, and it's because on this side I'm over 1, under 5, over 1, under 5. So you see more of the warp thread here, more of the weft thread here. So a weave is, just like I said, your denim blue jeans that you wear, that is twill weave. It's over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1 staggering. And it gives sort of a diagonal image to the textile, to the finished textile. That's a very sturdy weave, and it's what makes denim so sturdy and strong. Whereas the satin, when I cut it, it's going to fray almost immediately because there's so much less structure to it. It's under 1, over 5, under 1, over 5. So there's a lot more room for that fiber to come undone, or the weave to come undone. So satin is a type of weave. Silk is a type of fiber. You can have a silk satin. That is a satin weave made out of silk. But you can also make a cotton satin, normally called sateen, but it's the same weave but with a cotton thread. Theoretically, you could make it out of wool. Polyester is another fiber, so you could have a polysatin. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Satin is the weave, silk is the fiber content. So if someone says, "Oh, it's made out of 100%," it's a beautiful lustrous satin, that doesn't tell you what the fiber content is. But if someone says it's a silk satin or a poly satin, then you know that the satin is woven out of that fiber. All right, so that is the weave, the textile, and the fiber. The last thing that I want to talk to you about today is bias. And I'm going to go back to our friendly gingham because it's good and sturdy. To make a bias, what I want to do is find that edge black line. It's nice and straight. My ruler that I'm working with is a 3-inch ruler. Now I have set the 45-degree line on this ruler so that it runs along that black thread. If I flip to the other side of the ruler, or I had a ruler that didn't have that handy 45-degree angle, what I would do is take 3 inches, that's my square, and if I run my 3-inch mark, so I'm going to start here at 17 and go down to 14, it is right on that black line again. That's a 45-degree angle as well. And then I'd mark that with chalk, in this case because it's a dark textile. But I could, if it were light, I could use a pencil or one of our favorite friction pens. Now, I now have this as my beginning line. I can determine how wide I want my bias tape to be. For instance, for this, I'll do it at 2 inches. So I'm going to set my ruler so that it's on 2 inches, following that line, and I'm going to mark another line. Then I'll move up another 2 inches, and I'll make another line. And another 2 inches, and another line. All right. Now, if you want, you can use a rotary cutter for this. And it certainly does speed up making bias. I've talked to you guys a little bit about the rotary cutters. They're incredibly sharp. They have a guard on them. When you're not using them, you want that guard on. You pull the guard back. Use a nice ruler. Now, they also make a metal mesh glove that is great for this. You'd wear the metal mesh glove on this hand that is more vulnerable. It just, in case your rotary cutter jumps the ruler, it'll protect your hands. Now you'll notice that I have the palm of my hand down on the table and my fingers holding the rotary cutter, or the ruler as the rotary cutter goes across. That just stabilizes everything and makes it much easier to deal with. A 36 by 24 rotary mat and a rotary cutter is probably going to set you back, depending on the quality you get, under $50. So if you wanted to make your own bias and you wanted to get the ruler and the rotary cutter and a mat to do it, that would certainly speed the process of making bias up. But you can certainly mark it with your chalk line and just use your good fabric shears to cut along, right? And just keep doing the same thing over again. Now, when I'm making a large quantity of bias tape, and I'm actually today going to be making a large quantity of bias tape after I finish this lecture, and more to come on that later, I will mark the top and the same edge all the way along. So if this piece were considerably wider, I would just keep marking those spaces. This allows me to know that if I want to turn this into one long strip, I need to bring this end down to there and that end up to there so that it always goes marked edge, unmarked edge. And then you can make one long continuous piece. Now, having cut it out of a 8.5-inch square, I'm not getting nice big pieces of bias. But if I were cutting this off of a 45-inch wide piece of fabric, then I need to either mark the whole thing or get clever about how I fold it. And I can show you that on Thursday's lecture, but for now I just wanted to show you that. If I were to join these two, I would want them to join so that it made one continuous piece like this. So I would bring those up like that. You'll note that I'm sliding this over a little bit. That's because, let's put this on one of the grid lines. All right, so that's that. That's that, and you can see that when I move this up so that I have a 1/4-inch seam line, that seam line is going to run from that notch to that notch. And I'll just pin it in place for now so that you can see that. But if I were to stitch this, it would be the same sort of thing. And if I've done this correctly, from notch to notch, and this were a stitch, not a pin, then I could just pull this down and you'll see that that makes one nice continuous piece of bias tape. I'm going to be producing a large quantity of bias tape today because I'm going to engage in making some cotton face masks for first responders in the area. These will not, clear and upfront, these will not prevent the transmission of the COVID-19 virus. It will, however, act as a first line of defense, and there are many hospitals and nursing homes and first responders in the country that are desperately looking for anything, and they've called on the quilting community to help build some face masks. There are some really great tutorials. I'm going to link a couple of them for Thursday's class, and I'm going to show you my own way of making them, and if you would like, I would encourage you to consider making maybe some face masks for you and your family, and more on that on Thursday. All right, so that is today's lecture. Hopefully you've already watched the Stitch in Time on Marie Antoinette, and you can get out your muslin squares and see if you can pick out a single thread all the way across that muslin. And if you would like to try making some bias, take one of your 10-inch squares that I gave you of the plain cotton muslin. They look something like this. And try drawing yourself some bias lines and cutting out some bias. All right, thank you. I hope you are all staying very safe and following the social distancing that we're all being encouraged to do. And I will have more for you on Thursday. We'll actually look at some patterns and how grain lines are drawn on patterns, and we'll go from there. All right, goodbye and go in peace.